Hello, welcome to this tutorial. We're going to be building a JavaScript app that's going to take an array of random elements, and you'll be able to sort the array, generate a new random array, and switch between kinds of charts. And this will all be using native JavaScript as well as a library called chart.js. Okay, so I've gone ahead and set up just a basic HTML file here. We're going to be importing 3 files. One is just going to be the style sheet. It's just going to be basic CSS. We have a sort.js file that we're going to write. And then this is the chart.js library file. And to download this, come on over to chartjs.org, get started, and chart.js CDN right here. And you can download this chart.min.js file and just place it in whatever your directory is. Okay, so let's go ahead and start off. We want to get the hardest part out of the way first, and that's going to be our actual sorting and array generation. Okay, so let's go ahead and start this sort.js file. What are we going to need? Well, we're going to need the array of random values. We're going to need a sorted version of that array. So let's go ahead and start that. And we're going to make it a size of a variable called array size. Okay. Now in my example, I had array size as 40, so we can just stick with that. Okay, so what's next? We have to pass through our array and assign a random number into every element. So we're going to be assigning 40 random numbers. So how can we do this without writing 40 individual lines of code to put these values in? The best way to do this, in my opinion, is just with a for loop, or any kind of loop really, but I will be using a for loop. We're going to put this inside a function called generate_array, and the reason I'm going to put most of this stuff in functions is because we're going to be calling it from this file over here, and if we didn't have it in functions, we'd have to rewrite all the code if we wanted to use it over here. So it's just saving code reuse, and it's generally just good practice to put most of your stuff in functions. So we'll say we'll start our counter at 0. We'll go until it's array size and increment it by 1. Now you might be thinking, why this is not including array size, so this is wrong. But it's actually correct. If we did this, this would be wrong because we're starting our counter at 0. We're not starting our counter at 1, so it's 0, 1, 2. So you don't want to include this array size because 0 to 39 is 40 elements. You could do this if you started your counter at 1. Either or works, but I just have gotten used to doing it this way. Okay, so for every I in our array, which will go from 0 to 39, which is all 40 elements, we want to generate a random number. And we're going to do this with another function. Now, let's think about this for a second. If the range of our random number is too big, if it's an infinite range, the size of our bars are going to be way different from each other. Some bars are going to be so small that you're not going to be able to see them. So we want to limit the size of the numbers, or the range of the numbers we can generate. We're going to create 2 variables for this. We're going to call them min and max. So we're going to say min, we'll say the minimum value we want to generate is going to be 3, and the max can be 250. This will be pretty decent at preventing duplicates. If you just had 3 to 25, you have 40 elements, right? So the chance that you're going to have a pair of numbers used over and over again is pretty high. Now we're going to take this one step farther. We're going to do another measure to try to prevent duplicates. It's not going to be perfect, but it's going to soften the duplicates up a bit. So we're going to do a check here using an if statement. We're going to say if the current element we're on is the same as the element before it, or I minus 1, the element before it in the array, we want to regenerate that number that we're at. and we'll pass in min and max. We want to pass in min and max here as well. Okay, so let's go ahead. Actually, first let me explain this a little bit. So like I said, this is not going to be a perfect prevention for duplicates because it's only checking the element before it. You could do it, I believe, recursively, but that's code that I don't want to write. So I'm just going to be checking the element before it. So if there's a duplicate, let's like 3 values before the one you're on, it's not going to find that. But if it's the same as the one directly next or directly to the left of it, it'll regenerate it. Okay, so let's do this other function now, the generate array value function. Okay, let's do this. So what do we want to do? We want to generate a random number within our specified range of min and max. So JavaScript makes this pretty easy for us. We can just say, let me just write this out here and then I'll explain it. Okay, so this part here, this generates a random number between min and max, but the value that this is going to return is a decimal. And just for, vision, I guess, ease of reading, we want it to be an integer. So math.floor is just going to round that number down, giving us an integer. Okay, so let's just make sure that this array generation is actually working. Let's go ahead and check. We should get an array of 40 elements, and they should all be random numbers. And if you look here, you can see 40 elements, and they're all a random number between 3 and 250. And there shouldn't be any duplicates directly next to each other. There may be some like a few away, but there shouldn't be any directly next to each other. Okay, so that works. Now let's go ahead and sort the array. This is kind of the fun part. This is the part that if you're doing like a coding interview, something like that, this is the kind of question they're going to ask you, and kind of a sort of beginner version of the things that you're going to have to do in a coding interview. This is just going to be bubble sort, so it's going to be this is going to be a super simple one. If you're in a coding interview, you're probably going to be getting something a bit more complex. So let's do this. We're going to call bubble sort and pass an array, and now let's create our bubble sort function. We're going to be passing in the array. Okay, so we want to get the values from array and put them in the sorted array, because right now there's not any actual values inside sorted array. We're only generating them inside this first array here. So to do this, we're just going to copy the values from array into sorted array. So sorted array is equal to the array elements from array. Okay, so I wasn't really satisfied with my original explanation of bubble sort, so I'm recording this after and I'm re-explaining it. So let's take a look at this. So to implement bubble sort, we're going to be using a nested loop. We're going to be using 2 for loops, one inside of the other. So let's just picture our array here. We have an array. Let's just say we have like 4 elements for simplicity. We have like 3, 1, 2, 4. So our first loop is going to be going through this array one time. So we're going to be going through the whole array, right? And this first loop is going to be executing until we're sorted. Okay, so now what is the second loop doing? The second loop is passing through the whole array again, but at every element, it's testing the element next to it. So it's starting here, and it's testing these 2 elements. If the one on the right is bigger than the one on the left, obviously they're out of order because it's a sorted array. The bigger values are on the right. So we'll swap this, and we'll get 1, 3, 2, 4, And then we'll be testing these two values, and we see that these are also out of order, so we'll be swapping these. And then we'll get 1, 2, 3, 4. This inner loop will finish, so the second loop is finishing, it's finished, and then the first loop goes through, and it sees that the array is completely sorted, so both loops are finished, and therefore your array is sorted. So now let's actually get to coding this. So let me hide this here, and let's get right on moving to where we need to go. So let's make this loop. So we're going to go 4, we're going to start our first at 0. We're going to go until it's less than array size, and increment by 1. And we're going to set the second loop up just a tiny bit differently. The only difference is it's going to be array size minus 1. And the reason for this is, let me go back to my trusty whiteboard here. Because we're testing j plus 1, right? And once we reach this element right here, there is no j plus 1. There's no element here to test. So the JavaScript wouldn't break if we tested it here. Some other languages it probably would break, but it's just good practice to not test when there's no element here. So we're going to stop the testing right here, which will be testing these two. So that's why that one is minus 1. Okay, and now let's do that swap that we see when they're out of order. So how do we test this? We're just going to use an if statement. If sorted array of j is bigger than the one to the right, which is sorted array of j plus 1, then we're going to do something. We're going to swap them. So we need to have a temporary variable here, sorted array j, and then we're going to change j. Since it's saved now, we have it saved in x. Sorted array j is going to become sorted array j plus 1. And then j plus 1 is going to be equal to the original value of sorted array j, which is now saved in x. Okay. Now let's console log sorted array. Now my project is finished, so I just want to make sure that the sorted array is still showing in the console correctly. So let me turn this back on. Let's refresh. Okay. And as you can see, our bubble sort is successfully implemented. Now, we've done the hard part, really. Now, all we have to do is put this data into a visual form. We're not going to be creating any new data, really. We're just going to be using this data that we've made now and visualizing it. So let's go back to index.html here. This is where things get a little more fun. So first, let's create our style sheet. And we're just going to have some super basic styles here. I'm going to change my font to Calibri, just because that's my favorite font. And we're going to set up an ID for an element we're going to create called container, and we're going to center it. Okay. So what are we going to do? Let's create like it's sort of a title first. Okay. Let's create a canvas, which is where our chart is going to be. Okay. And now let's go ahead and create our chart. Like I said, we're going to be using this library called chart.js, and they have a very specific way in their documentation that you set up a chart. You can see it right here. So we're not just going to copy paste this because there's a lot of stuff that we don't need. I'm just going to rewrite it with the stuff that we do need. So it's going to go inside of a script. And we're going to create this variable called ctx. And it's going to target this canvas that we just created right here. This is where we're actually generating our chart. Okay, we're going to need a few data points here. So we're going to need one called the type of graph. We're just going to start off with bar. Or we're going to need the data and information about that data. Okay, in here we're going to need something called labels. We need another one called data sets. And then outside of data, we're going to create another one called options. In this one, we're just going to be turning our legend off because we don't need a legend in this. It's all just random array values, so we don't really need to know what they are. It'll just make our graph look better, to be honest. Okay, so data sets, let's go in here first. This is a bit more important. So the data we're going to be using for this graph is just our array. And this is as easy as it is. This is all you have to do to put an array of values into a chart using this library. And this is why we use a library, right? Because if we weren't, we'd have to go in, we'd have to write all this CSS and sit there tweaking it for hours, right? Or you can just use this wonderful library and save yourself a whole bunch of time and probably get a much more efficient and better outcome. Okay. So we're passing an array. We're passing in our array, and that's a comma, not a semicolon. Oh, we want the background color of our bars. I'm just going to set them to purple. You can really make it whatever color you want. You can individually define each bar. So if it's not this quite exact same syntax, but you can define a unique color for every bar that you generate. And since you know that you have 40 elements, you can define 40 different background colors for each of those bars. But I'm not going to be doing that because that's a lot of copy pasting. And we're going to set a border width here, which is just going to create some space between our bars. Okay, now this is the not fun part. I'm sure there's a way to do this dynamically, but I'm pretty new to the chart library, so I couldn't figure it out. I'm just going to do it manually. So element 1. And 40. Okay, so now we should have a chart of our randomly generated array elements. Let's go ahead and check. Oh, I've made a syntax error. Line 38. And yes, I put a semicolon here where it doesn't belong. Okay. Let me make sure this looks okay in my viewing program or recording program. Suppose I can make this a bit bigger for a moment. Okay, so yeah, we have a chart of our randomly generated array values, and we can see this here. So this is the unsorted version. So let's check if these values match. So we have 98, 90, 158, 156, or 56, and let's check 98, 90, 158, 56, and so on. And you get the idea. So we are successfully generating a chart using our random array values that we created over here in sort.js. And it was super easy, right? Using chart.js, super easy. Okay, let's add some more fun functionality now. Let's add a bit more functionality. What can we do here? Well, of course, we want to be able to sort the graph, right? How do we do this? Well, Chart.js again makes it super easy for us. So we're going to create a button down here, HTML button. We're going to set the value equal to sort array, and on click we want to call a function we're going to write called sort array. And this function is not actually going to be sorting our array because we already have our sorted array, right? We've done it over here. All we have to do is update the graph to show the sorted array instead of the unsorted array. But let's make another button too that we're going to make, and we're going to call it reset array because we want to be able to regenerate the array. So actually we'll say regenerate array. And we'll create a function for it called reset array. Okay, so go ahead and come down here and let's create this function. Function sort array. So what are we going to do? Well, where is this chart getting this information from, right? So it's inside this my chart. It's inside data. Inside data is data sets, and inside data sets is this data variable we're setting here, right? We're setting it to array. So all we have to do is change this value to sorted array. And Chart.js makes this super easy. So remember the layout of what I just said. Inside my chart, inside data sets is where we want. So let's go ahead and reference this. We'll go to my chart.data.data sets, and we have to put an array value here, and then .data. So my chart data sets data. My chart data sets data. And we're going to set that to sorted array. And then we just want to update the chart. So let's see if that works. Let's come here, let's click sort. And as you can see, we are successfully updating the chart to use our sorted array instead of our random out of order array. So now let's create this reset button or regenerate button. Now, like I said earlier, we put this generate array into a function because we want to call it from over here. So what do we do when we want to reset the array? We just want to regenerate those values, right? We're not recreating a new array or anything. We're just resetting the values that are inside of it. And this is going to pass through every element of the existing array that's defined right here and put a new value in. So all we have to do is call this function, right? So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to say generate array. And then what's the issue here now? The issue is our sorted array is not being regenerated because we're not calling the sort. The sorted array is going to still contain the elements from the array we generated before we click this button. We have to update sorted array contain the values of the latest array we've generated. Because we're not calling it inside the generate function, we're calling it down here. So we have to recall it with the new array that we just generated. So let's just recall it. That gets the job done. So now we have a sorted, now our sorted array variable is updated to our latest array. And then I'm just going to change it back to show the unsorted form. And then we're going to update the chart again. Okay, let's make sure this works. Reset array should generate new values. And look at that, it does. And then sort array should update those new values. So let's take a look here. You should see our lowest value should be 10. Our highest is going to be right here, which is 245. Let's sort it. 10, 245. So everything is working correctly. Now I really just want to add a little more customization here. We're going to add 2 more buttons. We want to be able to switch between kinds of graphs, because Chart.js, wonderfully, we can use these same values to define 2 different kinds of graphs. There's actually a lot more than 2, but these are the 2 that this information will work for. So we have bar, which we're looking at now. We have horizontal bar, which is, I'm not going to count as one. It might just be a horizontal bar. It's one of these variations. There is a horizontal bar, but we're going to just say polar area because this is the cool one. So look at this. Without changing any of our functionality, any of our information except this type variable here, we've changed it to a completely different kind of graph, and we can still sort it. We can still regenerate it. It all still works. It just looks a lot cooler. So we're going to give the user the option to switch between the bar graph and this polar area graph. So we're going to make it default to bar when the user first loads the page. Now, how are we going to let the user do this? We're going to create 2 new functions, but first let's create 2 new buttons. So let's get our buttons. We're just going to copy these ones. And I'm going to put them actually above the chart. And this is going to be show bar chart, show polar area chart. And these are going to be 2 new functions respectively named show bar and show polar. Let's make sure these buttons load. They don't do anything yet, but they're there. Okay, so let's create these functions. Function set bar, function set polar. Okay, let's do this. So unfortunately, it's not quite as easy as, let's say, updating the data elements. We can't just like reference it like we do here. We actually have to destroy the chart and then regenerate it in the way that we want. So let's do this with polar first, just so we can kind of demonstrate how this is going to work. So sadly, even though we spent so much work on it, we're going to destroy. The first thing we're going to do is destroy this chart. And then, well, what do? We just regenerate it in the kind that we want. So you can literally just come in here, you can copy this, and you can paste it in here. Now remove this variable because you don't want to redeclare an existing variable, and then change the type to polar area. Okay, and now this show polar area chart button should work. It's not working. It is not working. Ah, show bar, show polar. Okay. Sorry about that. Show bar, show polar. Okay, now this should work. So show polar area chart, and look at that. It's the same values, it's the same array values. We're just showing it in the polar area version, and now the user has the ability to switch between them. So we're just gonna copy this all, and this is gonna go into our show bar function. And the only thing we're gonna change is that this is bar, right? So now we have full functionality. We can regenerate the array, sort the array, switch back and forth, polar area, bar, polar area. You see it's still the same values until we regenerate it. And we can sort it, come here. This is still the same values, you just have to resort it when you switch back and forth. So yeah, that's it. I hope you learned something. This is a very basic implementation of arrays. This is for beginners where you don't really know much about functional programming. You don't really know much about working with arrays and sort of manipulating them. So I think this is a good starting point for you if you want to learn like web dev and JavaScript. It gives you a very basic idea on how functions work, how you can kind of visualize arrays and data structures, and getting started using JavaScript libraries. If you liked using Chart and you think you want to, sort of expand on this app and maybe implement different kinds of sorts or something along those lines, I'd recommend just coming into the Chart.js documentation, just looking around. It's actually really detailed and awesome. So I'm sure you could learn a lot more about chart that I didn't utilize here. So good luck. If you make anything cool, let me know. That'd be awesome to see. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.